Hello. Hi, guys. Welcome. Happy Sunday night. Um, Back to some reading. So I hope you guys are having a good night. Um, for those of you who may not have seen my Alibi and Ashes stream, I have a new webcam, which is a little difficult for me to get used to because I used to look over here to look at the camera, and now I'm looking straight ahead to look at the camera. So um, just some reorganization. So anyway, I hope you guys are having a great night. I know that there's like three other streams going on right now within our little Twitch community that I'm part of. So it's okay if you guys are rewatching this instead of watching it live, but I hope you enjoy it anyway. So I just wanted to get through some more Secrets Can Kill. We had read the first 4 chapters together 3 weeks ago. It's been a while. Maybe even a month ago. So I just want to kind of get back into that. So anyway, anybody who may watch this later, just don't forget that I don't respond to the chat until in between chapters. So I will just get on in it. Okay. Chapter 5. At the last possible second, Nancy pushed her body to the limit, twisted desperately in midair, and hit the floor with her rear end. Thank goodness not with her head. It wasn't the most graceful move she'd ever made, but as she sat there breathing shakily, she decided that it was better to be a klutz than a corpse. Nancy was tempted to prove to Carla then and there that she was ready to fight the battle, but when she got to her feet, she noticed that the gym teacher was doing it for her. Dalton! Miss Gibbs was livid. This isn't the pom-pom squad. You have to use your brains in here if you have any. Drew could have broken her neck. Which would not have broken Carla's heart, Nancy thought grimly. It would have made her day. Most of the girls had rushed over to Nancy, asking if she was all right, whether she needed to see the nurse, whether she was sure nothing was broken. Thanks, Nancy said gratefully. I'm still in one piece, but I think I lost something. What? Somebody asked. An inch off my hips, Nancy joked. It's permanently embedded into the gym floor. 20 minutes later, Nancy took her seat in social studies. She was still slightly rattled and was hoping for a lecture so she could just take notes and get her breath back. Okay, the teacher said gleefully. Clear your desks of everything but paper and pen. It's pop quiz time. Nancy joined the other kids in groaning and took as long as possible finding a notebook and pen. Don't worry, the boy behind her said. Mr. Warder's quizzes are so bad nobody passes. If you flunk, you won't be alone. Right, the girl said to her left. The only one with a chance is Hal Morgan. Nancy glanced to her right and noticed that Hal Morgan was chewing his fingernails nervously. He doesn't look too confident, she whispered. Yeah, that's weird, the girl whispered back. You know, it's funny, Hal's been the class brain forever, always studying, you know. Never had time for anything else. But then this September he surprised everybody by running for class president against Darryl Gray. He didn't win, but he sure did try. I can't believe how much time he spent campaigning. Maybe that's why he looks nervous, Nancy said. Maybe his grades dropped during the campaign. The girl shrugged. Maybe, but he's been talking about going to Harvard, so he must be doing something right. And his SATs were off the top of the scale. Okay, scholars, Mr. Warner cackled. Let's get this show on the road. By the 5th question, Nancy had decided that the boy behind her was right. There was no way she was going to pass this quiz. At least she didn't have to worry about her grade point average like everyone else. She glanced at the clock to see how much more torture she might have to go through. As she did, she noticed that Hal Morgan seemed to be having trouble concentrating. In fact, his eyes were on Nancy's paper. As soon as he saw her glance at him, he looked away. The teacher asked the next question, and Nancy wrote down her answer. Then she deliberately put her hands to her hair so her paper would be clear. Sure enough, Hal made a pretense of stretching and yawning, and as he rolled his head around, his eyes once more zeroed in on Nancy's paper. It was obvious to Nancy anyway that Hal the Brain was copying her answers, but why? Why would somebody so smart bother to cheat on a pop quiz? Well, it sure isn't going to do him any good, she thought as they passed their papers to the front. Hal's going to get exactly what I get, which is probably a 50. She didn't think much more of the incident until after class. As she left the room, she saw Jake Webb lurking in the hall. Then she saw Hal walk up to him reluctantly, the way most people walk into a dentist's office. Wondering what those two could possibly have in common, Nancy attached herself to a group of kids who were standing around moaning about the quiz. It was hard to hear everything, but she caught enough to make her extremely curious. "Listen," Hal was saying, "I've got my own essay to write before I can even get to yours." "That's cool," Jake said. I'll give you till tomorrow. How's that?" "That's not enough time, and you know it." Hal sounded panicky. "Oh, too bad," said Jake sarcastically. "Well, I guess I don't have to tell you what'll happen, right?" Hal let out a big sigh, and Nancy saw the defeated look on his face. Okay, he said. "You'll have it tomorrow." That guy's really the pits, Nancy thought as she watched Jake walk cockily down the hall. He acts like a king, and he's got at least two lackeys, Walt and Hal, doing his bidding. How many others are hustling to follow his orders, and why? Why would anyone want to do anything for Jake Webb? Without really thinking about it, Nancy had begun following Jake, but when she saw him turn into another hall and open his locker, she decided she might learn something about him if she could see what was inside that locker. She didn't know what she'd be looking for. Money, maybe, but it was worth a try. As she passed, she got a look at the locker number, 515, and before Jake saw her, she walked quickly to the water fountain at the end of the hall. She had to drink enough to float a ship, but finally she saw Jake's scuffed sneakers pass by and out of sight. It was lunchtime, and the hall was empty. Nancy moved quickly to locker 515. A credit card wouldn't be any help this time, but a professional lockpicker's kit would. Fortunately, along with her makeup and lunch money, Nancy's canvas bag just happened to have such a kit. She found the right size pick and had the padlock off in half a minute. She pulled the door open and was ready for a leisurely exploration when she heard a voice. "Be back in a second," it said. "I forgot my psych book." It was Jake Webb. Quickly, Nancy raked her eyes over the inside of his locker. Only one thing caught her attention, a shoebox. Dangling from it was a beautiful gold bracelet, exactly like Connie Watson's. That was all Nancy had time for. She shut the door and moved away just as she heard Jake's footsteps round the corner. "He has no way of knowing what you were up to," she told herself. "Just keep on going." Nancy kept on going, but she was sure Jake Webb's eyes were on her back every step of the way. She was glad to get out of his sight, though once she was, Nancy still couldn't relax. What was Connie's bracelet doing in the shoebox in Jake Webb's locker? It had to be the same bracelet. It was an antique, probably one of a kind. Maybe Connie lost it, and Jake, lowlife that he was, found it and decided to stash it. When Nancy spotted Connie in the lunch line, she decided to make sure she was right. "Hi," she said. "Guess what? I think I know where your bracelet is." Connie jumped as if she'd been stung. "My bracelet?" Nancy pointed to Connie's bare wrist. "Right, you lost it, didn't you?" Connie nodded, her eyes wide. "Well," Nancy went on, "I'm pretty sure I saw it. Are you ready? In Jake Webb's locker." Shaking her head, Connie backed away slowly, fear in her eyes. It couldn't be mine," she stammered. I lost mine at home. I mean, I didn't lose it. I just didn't wear it today. That's all." "Connie, what's wrong?" "Nothing," the frightened girl said. "Really, nothing's wrong. I have to go. There's this meeting I forgot about. I have to go," she said again, and all but ran away. Some really weird things are going on at Bedford High, Nancy thought as she watched Connie hurry off. And so far they all lead to one person, Jake Webb. She didn't know if Jake was the phantom vandal or even the anonymous videotaper, but she did know he was up to something, and all she had to do was find out what. By the end of the day, Nancy was ready to explode. First, Connie had treated her as if she had some horrible communicable disease. Then she couldn't find Walt Hogan or Hal Morgan, so she hadn't been able to question them. Plus, her rear end still ached from that fall off the trampoline. Things were definitely not going well. What she wanted most of all was to go home and soak in a hot tub. Instead, Nancy decided she'd better make another pass at that video lab. She didn't want to leave Bedford High empty-handed, not for the second day in a row. The lab wasn't locked. When Nancy walked in, the only person there was Darryl Gray, who was peering at a shelf of tapes. Suddenly she felt happy for the first time all day. "Am I glad to see you?" she cried. Darryl spun around, startled. Then his lips parted in his Porsche driver's grin. "Nancy Drew, isn't it? New girl and—" He glanced around the otherwise empty room. "Private Eye, how's the detective going?" "Don't ask," Nancy said with a groan. Anyway, what are you doing in here? I didn't know you belonged to the video club. I don't, Daryl said. I was just doing some detecting of my own, looking for you. He came to stand within hugging distance of Nancy. Looks like we found each other. The nearness of him made Nancy forget all her problems. I'm glad we did, she said. I'm so glad, in fact, that I'm inviting you to go for a Coke, right now. Sounds great to me. Good, I'll drive, Nancy said teasingly, and let you see what my Mustang can do. As they walked through the parking lot, Nancy spotted Jake Webb among the cars. Probably siphoning gas, she thought. Every time she saw him, she remembered how he'd threatened her on the stairs the day before. Was that his first threat, or had he tried to scare her off with that videotape? Then Daryl put his hand casually on Nancy's shoulder, and she forgot about Jake Webb and simply enjoyed the touch of Daryl Gray. How's it going, really? Daryl asked again as they got into the Mustang. Have you found any clues? Are any of the pieces fitting together yet? Nancy started the car with a roar. I never thought I'd say this, she admitted with a wry smile, but right now the last thing on earth I want to do is solve a mystery. Glad to be leaving, Nancy headed out of the parking lot and down Bedford Road. Daryl didn't ask any more questions about the case, and she was grateful. There'd be plenty of time to think about it later. Just then, all she wanted to do was drive. As they headed away from the high school, Bedford Road became narrow and winding. Through the trees, Nancy caught glimpses of water. That's Bedford Lake, Daryl pointed out. It has some nice secluded benches. Why don't you drive down there? Down is right, Nancy thought as the grade suddenly became steeper. She'd been doing about 35, and all of a sudden the needle climbed to 50. A blind curve was coming up. Nancy put her foot on the brake. The pedal sank to the floor, but her stomach sank with it. Hey, Daryl said, I don't want to sound like a driver's ed teacher, but don't you think you should slow down a little? Nancy couldn't answer him. The brakes were gone, and her car was shooting down the winding road completely out of control. Dun, dun, dun. Just kidding. Let me just respond to a message real quick. Okay. Chapter 6. The car picked up speed, careening wildly down the hill. Nancy downshifted to second, then to first. The Mustang slowed, but not enough. Sharp curve coming up, Daryl spoke quietly, but Nancy heard the quiver in his voice. She couldn't blame him. She was too terrified to speak. Hands glued to the wheel, Nancy guided the car into the curve, praying that she wouldn't meet another car coming up. The road remained clear, but it also grew steeper, and as she came out of the bend, she could see the stop sign at the bottom of the hill. It was still 50 yards away, but in her imagination she was already on top of it, could see the Mustang tearing into the intersection and colliding with whoever was unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Amazed that her hand was steady, Nancy reached over and slowly pulled up the handbrake. It didn't work. The car was going so fast that the brakes burned out. The stop sign was looming up like a monster's claw in a 3D movie. There was no time to think. Instinctively, Nancy aimed her car at the soft shoulder on the opposite side of the road. With an impact that snapped their heads back, the Mustang hit the bank, went up on two wheels, and wobbled for what seemed like an eternity, but finally, with a bone-jarring thump, it landed upright. Nancy shut her eyes and leaned her head on the steering wheel. She was breathing like a marathon runner. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Daryl pry his hand loose from the dashboard. Well, he said with a gasp, so that's what your Mustang can do? Nancy reached for his hand and held on tight. She felt like crying, but when she opened her mouth, a giggle came out. It was a perfectly normal hysterical reaction, she told herself, and then she giggled again. There was a smile in Daryl's voice as he said, How about letting me in on the joke? It's just, Nancy tried to stop laughing and couldn't. I remembered that my car is due for inspection in 2 weeks. Now the gears are probably stripped and the front bumper has to be completely smashed and the brakes are burned out. This last thought brought Nancy out of her dream world. Her car. What had gone wrong? True, it had needed an inspection, but that was just an official thing. Besides, she'd had new brakes installed 6 weeks ago. Something awfully strange was going on, and whatever it was, Nancy had a definite feeling that it wasn't good. She pushed open the door and jumped out. Hey, where are you going? Daryl called, rolling down his window. He stuck his head out and saw Nancy kneeling by the front left wheel, peering underneath the fender. What is it? He asked. Nancy stood up, so angry she could hardly see straight. The brake cable, she said, grimacing. It's been cut. What? Are you sure? I don't get it. Who would... Wait. Nancy held her hand up for quiet. Then she sniffed the air. Frowning, she ran to the back of the car and sniffed again. What's wrong now? Nancy could hardly believe what she was going to say. That rock we went over? I think it cracked the gas tank. Daryl, the car could blow. It could blow any second. She started down the hill. Get out of the car! Hurry up! There were no footsteps behind her. Nancy, she heard Daryl call. Nancy, I can't open the door. It's jammed. Nancy didn't hesitate. She raced back to the car and fought with the door from the outside, but she couldn't get a good grip on the handle because the door was on an angle, leaning toward her. She ran to the driver's side. The smell of gas fumes was stronger than ever. Get your seatbelt off, she said to Daryl, finally managing to open her door. She helped him climb out. Now let's go. She grabbed his hand. The car's already beginning to burn, she said as they ran desperately down the hill. When the car blew, they were only a few yards away from it. The force of the explosion flung them into the underbrush by the side of the road. They clung to each other. For a moment, hardly able to speak, they stared at the burning sports car. Nancy, are you all right? Daryl whispered at last. His eyes were bright with concern. Nancy nodded. Feeling the heat of Daryl's breath against her cheek, she hardly noticed her bruised knees and scratched arms. It seemed the most natural thing in the world for them to keep their arms around each other. Nancy closed her eyes and breathed deeply. When Daryl had first touched her 2 days before, in the hallway, she'd wondered what his arms would feel like. Now she knew. They felt fabulous. But with that fabulous feeling came another feeling. Guilt. It wasn't Ned whose arms were holding her. It wasn't Ned whose lips she was feeling, nor Ned whose voice was murmuring her name. And hadn't she said just 3 days before that nobody could compete with Ned Nickerson? Well, maybe no one could in the long run, but at the moment, in the short run, Daryl Gray was doing a pretty good job of it. It was a dangerous moment, emotionally, and Nancy knew that she wasn't ready to deal with it. Before Daryl's lips reached hers again, she eased himself gently from his arms. Hey, she said softly. Hey, yourself. Daryl's blue eyes were smiling. Looking at Nancy, he gave a long sigh. So, he said in a throaty voice, how about answering the question I never got a chance to ask? Who would do something crazy like this? I have a pretty good idea. Anger made Nancy's voice tight. She pulled away and felt herself stiffen. Does the name Jake Webb ring any bells? Jake? Sure, Daryl said slowly, sitting up. I can see him doing something like this, but there's no way you can prove it, is there? Nancy was silent for a moment. She was remembering Jake's threat on the stairs, remembering him in the parking lot half an hour ago, hearing that voice on the videotape. Stick with shopping, Nancy drew. It's a lot safer than snooping at Bedford High. Well, she hadn't done much snooping yet, but she hadn't backed off either. Had Jake, for some reason, decided to stop her before she got any further? You're right, she said as she and Daryl got up and brushed the leaves and dirt off their clothes. I can't prove it, but I think Jake's the one. So what are you going to do? Talk to him about it, Nancy said, first thing tomorrow morning. Nancy, I wouldn't do that, Daryl said quickly. Jake Webb's not the kind of guy you want to go around accusing of something. Believe me. I believe you, Nancy told him. I also think he has some explaining to do. Daryl took her hand, sounding really worried. You shouldn't mess with that guy, Nancy. I'm not going to mess with him. I'm just going to talk to him. In a way, Nancy was almost glad that Jake had given her something to think about. It took her mind off how she felt about Daryl, which was a mystery she didn't want to solve just then. Please don't worry. I'll be careful, she said, flagging down a car that was passing slowly. But Jake Webb is up to something, and I'm going to find out what it is. I think Daryl's right, George said as she drove toward Bedford High the next morning. Until Nancy got another car, George and Bess had to play chauffeur. I think you should steer clear of this Jake Webb and go right to the police. Show them your car. Let them deal with Jake. That's what I think, too. Bess leaned over the back seat and grinned at Nancy. Now tell us more about Daryl Gray. You'll probably meet him one of these days, Nancy said. She stared out at the beautiful Bedford houses, trying to decide the best way to approach Jake. Daryl was the least of her worries at the moment, even though she couldn't help remembering the kiss he'd given her after driving her home the previous night. Before he'd kissed her, he tried once again to talk her out of confronting Jake. Nancy was touched that he was so worried about her, but she was sure that she could handle Jake Webb. After all, she wasn't going to meet him in some dark alley. She was going to walk right up to him in the halls of Bedford High. She couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he saw that his gruesome plan hadn't worked, that she was alive and ready to take him on, the creep. What's happening? George interrupted Nancy's thoughts, pointing to the wide front steps of the high school. Nancy looked and saw at least half the student body milling around outside. The kids were talking in little clusters, waving their arms, pointing dramatically. Then she saw the police cars, one with its red lights still flashing. "Well, at least you'll have police protection when you talk to Jake," Bess joked. "I wonder what they're here for." "Good question," Nancy said. Could Daryl have called them? She didn't think so. He tried to talk her out of dealing with Jake at least 10 times, but he'd never once suggested that she'd go to the police, which was a little strange when she thought about it. She didn't think about it for long, though. As soon as she got out of the car, she joined the nearest group of kids. "What happened?" she asked. "What's going on?" One of the girls turned to her, fear and excitement in her eyes. "It's Jake Webb," she said breathlessly. "He's been killed." That's the end of the chapter. Thank you for being here, Susan. I'm going to take a quick 2-minute break and just go get something to drink and use the restroom. So I'll leave you with some music and I will be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere, guys. Okay, I am back. Oh, let me get my water. The funniest thing to me about this book is that, I mean, obviously there's differences between the book and the game, Secrets Can Kill, Like there's little changes in the names and like, you know, Jake just died in the book where he's dead in the beginning of the mystery. But the weirdest part is that Nancy seems to be in love with Daryl Gray, and in the game, she like completely like rejects all of his offers. So to me, it's really funny the difference just in that. So, all right, we're gonna keep on trucking. Welcome to anybody who may have may have jumped in uh, on the little break. Welcome. Chapter 7. Nancy wondered for a moment if she'd heard right. Did you say killed? Dead? As a doornail. But how? Nobody knows for sure, the girl went on, but someone found him about 20 minutes ago and they say his neck's broken. She shivered. It's awful, isn't it? I heard the guy who found him is still throwing up. Personally, I'm sure I would have passed out. I mean, can you imagine? Nancy could hardly imagine any of it. All night she'd been getting ready to face Jake Webb, to accuse him, among other things, of trying to kill her. And in spite of what she told Daryl and Bess and George, she had been scared. Well, she wouldn't have to be scared anymore. Not of Jake Webb. Still finding the whole thing unbelievable, Nancy reported the news to Bess and George. Then she climbed the front steps and went into school. As she moved through the main hall, she heard bits and pieces of conversation that told her a little more about Jake Webb's demise. Right next to the video lab, at the bottom of the stairs. Hard cement stairs. Geez, no wonder the fall broke his neck. They say he's been dead for 2 hours. I mean, I wonder what he was doing here at 6 in the morning. Probably planting a bomb. Too bad he fell first. Fell? The guy didn't fall, no way. Did you hear about his face? Jake's face. That's what Nancy heard most about on her walk through the hall. His face was bruised and cut. The bruises could have come from a fall down a flight of cement stairs, but not the cuts around his eyes, not his split lip. Jake had been in a fight before he had hit the hard floor in front of the lab, and if that was true, Nancy thought, then he didn't fall. He was pushed, and if he was pushed, then her investigation had just taken a giant leap from vandalism to murder. No one she heard even pretended to feel sorry that Jake was dead, and as she thought about Hunk, Hal, Connie, and who knew how many others, she realized that a lot of people around Bedford High would have wanted Jake to vanish, but who would have wanted it badly enough to give him that push? When Nancy reached the scene of Jake's accident, the police and the man from the coroner's office were still gathered there. The body, thank goodness, was gone, but the chalk outline remained. She knew that if she talked to the police, then and there they'd listen to her. They'd probably even ask her to join their investigation. But if she did that, she'd blow her cover. And if she did that, she might as well kiss the secrets of Bedford High goodbye. Since the police were busy at the stairwell, Nancy decided that then might be a good time to check Jake Webb's locker. She wanted to look at the contents of that shoebox before anybody else got to it. What besides Connie's bracelet had Jake stashed away? She was so busy wondering if Jake's locker would have any clues hidden in it that she didn't see Daryl until she bumped into him. Daryl, hi! Even with everything else on her mind, Nancy felt a warm rush of feeling at the sight of him. I guess I don't need to ask if you've heard the news. Hardly. Daryl took her hand, but he did it in an absent-minded way. I just talked to Mr. Parton, he said, his voice low enough that only Nancy could hear him. He told me to tell you it's a murder, definitely. Nancy's eyes widened, but she wasn't really surprised. Did Mr. Parton say anything about me, about what I should do? Just that he wants you to stay on the case, Daryl whispered, and handle it your own way. Great, I was hoping he'd say that. Nancy breathed a sigh of relief and squeezed Daryl's hand. Now I can really follow some leads. She started to walk away, but Daryl held her back. Wait a second, he said. If Jake was the vandal, then your case is solved. You're into murder now, Nancy. I think you should back off. You've got to be kidding. Nancy couldn't help feeling insulted. Why should I back off? Do you think it's too complicated for me or something? No, I didn't mean that. Daryl's violet eyes were full of worry. It's just that it's probably going to get really dangerous, Nancy. You don't have any idea of what you're up against. No, I don't, but I'm going to find out. Nancy smiled at him. Thanks for worrying about me, but please try not to, she said. Really, I can take care of myself. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Carla Dalton heading toward them, and she couldn't resist planting a kiss on Daryl's cheek. She wanted to, anyway, but having Carla as a witness made it even more fun. Gotta go now, she told Daryl with a twinkle in her eye. I'll talk to you later if you know what I found, to let you know what I found out. The halls were still jammed with kids discussing the morning's main event, but luckily the final bell rang as Nancy reached Jake's locker. She was surprised that everyone was still marching to the sound of bells on that day of all days, but it was a good thing old habits died hard. The hall cleared in a matter of minutes. Nancy pulled on a pair of rubber gloves, no sense leaving fingerprints for the police, and quickly broke into locker 515. The shoebox was still there, but something else caught her eye first. With a grim smile, she pulled a pair of wire cutters off the shelf. Turning them over in her hands, Nancy thought how easily they must have snapped her brake cable. Underneath the wire cutters was a small black box. Nancy recognized it immediately as a battery pack for a video camera. She would have bet her $50 designer jeans that Jake stole it from the video lab and used it to tape her and Bess and George on their shopping spree. Finally, Nancy took out the shoebox and lifted the lid, her heart beating with anticipation. Connie's bracelet was still there, along with a recent article from the school newspaper that carried a picture of Walt Hogan being brutally tackled during a game. The headline read, "The hunk gets hit. He's down but not out." The story went on to explain that if Walt missed the upcoming All-State Championship game because of injury, his badly needed football scholarship and his ticket to the pros might be in jeopardy. But Walt had poo-pooed the injury, claiming that nothing would stop him from playing in the All-State game. At the bottom of the box, folded in half, was a wad of official-looking papers. As Nancy opened them, she recognized them at once without even reading the heading. They were SAT exams. There was just one difference between them and the ones she'd toiled over. The set of exams in Jake's locker already had the answers marked in. Nancy studied the curious contents of the box, trying to make sense out of them. She was positive now that Jake was the Bedford High vandal. The battery pack and the SATs pretty much proved that, but looking at the bracelet, she wondered if he was also into stealing. It really didn't matter if he was, except for one thing. Someone had killed him, and Nancy was determined to find out why. The police were going to be asking the same questions, she knew, so she put the shoebox, the wire cutters, and the battery pack back where she'd found them. She closed the locker door and was trying to come up with an excuse for being late to her first class when a voice behind her said, "Well, if it isn't Nancy Drew, girl detective. You always manage to be right in the swing of the nastiest things." Chapter 8. Oh, I think I remember this part of the book. Nancy whirled around and came face to face with a tall, black-haired young woman whose vivid red lips were curled in a scornful smile. Oh, great, Nancy thought. This is exactly what I need, a snake in the grass like Brenda Carlton. As she looked at Brenda, standing there in her trendy trench coat, a notebook and pen in one hand, Nancy felt like laughing. Brenda had delusions of being an investigative reporter for today's Times, her daddy's award-winning newspaper. But as far as Nancy was concerned, the only things Brenda did well were wear clothes and mess up Nancy's investigations. She'd done that too many times for Nancy ever to trust her, and there she was again, smirking and lurking. "Well, Brenda," Nancy said, "what are you doing here, trying to play reporter?" "I saw you first, Girl Wonder." Brenda gave Nancy a saccharine smile and flipped open her notebook. "Let's see," she said, pretending to scribble with her pen. "When this reporter arrived at Bedford High, the first person she ran into was none other than Nancy Drew, alleged private detective. How does that sound?" If she talks any louder, Nancy thought, the whole school's going to know who I am. "Okay, Brenda, what do you think I'm doing here? What do sleuths usually do at scenes of crimes?" "Scene of the crime? This looks like a high school locker to me, not the bottom of a stairwell." Brenda's green eyes swept over Nancy in a quick but all-seeing glance. Pointing a red-nailed finger at Nancy's history book, she smiled. "Oh, I see. You're posing as a student. How clever of you. I'm surprised you thought of it." Dropping the sweet voice, Brenda went on. "Now why don't you give me a few more details about what's going on here? If you don't, all your little high school friends are going to find out real fast what you're really up to, and I have a feeling you wouldn't like that at all." "Is that a threat, Brenda?" "Of course it is, Nancy. So how about it? Are you going to give me the whole story?" Nancy sighed. What choice did she have? The case was complicated and dangerous. She couldn't solve it and battle Brenda Carlton at the same time. "All right," she said, gritting her teeth. "I'll have to make a deal with you." "A deal?" Brenda's silky eyebrows drew together in a frown. "What kind of deal?" "The kind of deal that'll give you the exclusive story," Nancy told her. "Face it, Brenda, the police aren't going to give you the time of day, and right now I know more about what's going on than they do. So when it's over, I'll be able to give you the really sensational story right down to the last juicy detail." Nancy watched Brenda's frown change to a smile. Probably seeing her byline already, she thought, "There's just one catch," she warned. "I'll give you the story after I've solved the case, not before. If you want to know everything I do, stay out of my way, keep your mouth shut about who I am. Think you can manage that?" For about 30 seconds, Brenda wavered between taking her chances with the police then or making a deal with Nancy for later. Finally, she reached a decision. "All right," she said, pouting. "I'll do it your way. But," she warned, "you better keep your part of the bargain or the only role you'll ever play again is unemployed detective." Nancy bit her lip to keep back any insulting remarks that might blow the deal, but as she watched Brenda stroll away, she promised herself that someday she was going to close that reporter's notebook for good. Hey! Sorry. With the police swarming all over the school, Nancy's investigation didn't get very far. All the kids were talking about Jake, of course, but even so, Nancy wasn't able to learn much. All the kids had opinions, but they were just gossip and speculation. Nancy wanted to talk to the three people whom she knew had some connection with Jake: Walt Hogan, Hal Morgan, and Connie Watson. She didn't see Walt at all, and Hal didn't hear her call to him after American history, or maybe he didn't want to hear her. He looked extremely nervous. So did Connie, who once more acted as if Nancy had developed a sudden case of overwhelmingly bad breath. If anyone has any answers, Nancy thought, they're not admitting it. Nancy didn't have any answers either, but she thought she might find something in the video lab. Obviously, Jake had been borrowing the school's video equipment. Maybe Nancy could find some clue in the lab that could tell her why. The door was locked again, so Nancy used her credit card. As she worked the lock, she thought she heard a noise coming from inside the lab. She stopped, listening. There it was, a faint thump, as if someone had dropped something on the floor. Could a policeman be in there? It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the halls were empty of students, and Nancy had watched the 2 patrol cars drive off half an hour ago. Still, they might have left one officer behind to guard the school. If they had, Nancy decided that it wouldn't help her case any to get caught. She raised her hand and knocked loudly on the door. Then she listened again. No sound this time. After a few more loud raps, she decided that whatever she'd heard hadn't come from inside. The empty halls picked up sounds from everywhere. The noise could have come from the floor above. She worked the lock again and pushed open the door. The room was a wreck. Cables and wires were strewn across the floor like uncoiled snakes, and at least half the tapes had been pulled from the shelves and lay in scattered piles on the desk and on the floor. Nancy knew the police must have searched the place after finding that battery pack in Jake's locker. Either that, and they were real slobs, or someone else had been there. Could that someone have been Jake's murderer after some kind of evidence? Suddenly, Nancy didn't like all the silence around her. She cleared her throat noisily and told herself that if the murderer had been there, he or she was probably long gone. And from the look of things, he hadn't found what he was after. Maybe she could beat him to it. Nancy quickly closed the door behind her and stepped over several lengths of cable to the middle of the room. Her gaze fell on a neat row of about 30 tapes still on the shelf. Nancy crossed the room to the shelf and saw that the tapes were just rock videos. Glancing at the familiar names, Nancy thought maybe they weren't worth her attention. But then one of the labels caught her eye. Right next to Material Girl, which made her think immediately of Brenda Carlton, was a tape labeled I Spy. I Spy? It wasn't any rock group Nancy had heard of. Maybe I Spy was a Bedford High group. Nancy decided to have a quick look at it. She just hoped the music was good. After the first few seconds, Nancy wished that they were music. The tape was completely silent, but the images were so unbelievable that music would have made it seem like a joke or some kind of fantasy. Instead, Nancy knew she was seeing reality. The first person on the tape was Hunk Hogan. He was sitting on a bench in what must have been the locker room. No one else was visible, and when Walt glanced cautiously around, Nancy decided that he had decided he was alone. After another careful look, the star tackle reached into the duffel bag at his feet and took out a roll of white tape. Obviously in great pain, he began to wrap it around his rib cage, wincing the whole time. Nancy remembered the article in Jake's locker that told of Walt betting all his hopes for a football scholarship on the upcoming All-State game. From the look of him, he'd be lucky to get dressed for that game, much less play in it. Walt was hurt, but he'd hidden it. From everyone except Jake Webb. The video lab was stuffy and hot, but Nancy shivered as a chill ran up her spine. She'd been right. This case was much, much bigger than anyone thought. And the I Spy tape was an extremely hot piece of evidence. Too hot to be watching smack in the middle of Bedford High. Quickly, Nancy pushed the stop button and ejected the tape. She was reaching for the monitor to shut it off when she heard a noise, or thought she did. She snapped off the monitor and listened. For a few seconds, the only sound she heard was the blood pulsing in her ears, but then another noise, a squeak, as if someone had stopped leaning on a table or a door. At the far end of the room was a door marked supplies, and as Nancy listened again, she heard another muffled sound. Someone was in the supply room, and it wasn't a policeman. A policeman would have been out there by then, asking her what she was doing there, demanding that she turn over the tape, which was crucial evidence in a murder investigation. And who else would be interested in such crucial evidence but Jake's killer? For an instant, Nancy froze. If the killer was in that supply closet, Nancy's life was in danger. So was the evidence. She knew she had to get out fast. Noiselessly, she dropped the videotape into her bag. She wanted to run, but she was afraid of alerting whoever was behind the door. Slowly, quietly, she inched her way across the lab to the hall door. With a sweaty hand, she eased it open and slipped out. Then she tore down the hall as fast as she could. It was late afternoon and the hall was dark. The stairs leading to the first floor were even darker, but Nancy didn't slow down. She jumped down the last 4 steps, skidded around a corner, and raced toward the main door. As she neared it, she thought she heard footsteps on the stairs, but she didn't bother to turn around and make sure. Still moving fast, she rammed into the panic bar, expecting the door to fly open. The door didn't budge. Nancy was certain she heard footsteps behind her. She gave the door another desperate push. Nothing. Okay, she thought, I guess it's showdown time. Taking a deep breath, Nancy turned around, ready to face the intruder. Seeing how many chapters there are. Okay. So there's 18 chapters in this book, and I just finished chapter 8. So we're going to do one more chapter. Let me just go real quick. Okay. One more chapter. Ooh. Get comfy. And then I might switch over and play some Cat President. But one more chapter of this for now. Chapter 9. Nancy closed her eyes, waited a beat, then forced them open. The dark hall loomed ahead of her. She focused on the bottom of the staircase, held her breath, and waited again. All she saw were shadows, and all she heard was her own heartbeat. No one was there. Not now, anyway. Letting out her breath in a sigh of relief, Nancy leaned against the door and found herself falling backward as the door opened easily, depositing her on her rear on the stone steps outside. Of course, she thought, picking herself up, it's a double door. You just pushed the wrong side. Glad to be outdoors, Nancy took several deep gulps of the cool autumn air. Then she saw George's car make a slow turn around the side of the building. Hey! Nancy waved her hand and ran down the front steps. Here I am! The car slowed and Bess stuck her head out the window. We were just about to give up and go home, she said. George has been driving around this parking lot forever, but I kept telling her you'd probably gotten a ride with Daryl. I wish I had been with Daryl, Nancy said as she climbed into the back seat. He's a lot more fun and a lot safer, too. Why? What happened? George wanted to know. As they drove away from Bedford High, Nancy filled them in on everything that had happened, from the details of Jake's murder to her own scary escape from the video lab. And wait till you see the tape, she said, patting her duffel bag. It'll never win an Oscar, but it's one of the most fascinating movies I've ever seen. When they got back to Nancy's River Heights home and settled down to watch, they soon discovered that the tape was even more fascinating than Nancy had predicted. And Walt Hogan wasn't the only person Jake had made into a star. Bess sighed as she watched Hunk tape his ribs. How can he stand to play when he's in pain? It's his only chance for that scholarship, George said. If he doesn't get that, he'll never make the pros. Yeah, and he wasn't about to let anything stand in his way, Nancy commented. Not the pain, and not Jake. Poor guy, Bess sighed again. At least Jake Webb can't bother him any more. Do you suppose that Hunk is glad deep down that Jake's dead? He wouldn't be human if he weren't, Nancy said, but I have a question for you. Do you suppose Walt Hogan had anything to do with getting rid of Jake? Before either of her friends had a chance to answer that startling question, another face appeared on the television screen, the smooth, round face of Connie Watson. Who's that? Bess asked. A girl from Bedford High, Nancy told her, and scooted to the edge of the couch, wondering what on earth Shy Connie could possibly have done to get a part in Jake Webb's movie. She soon found out. The setting was a sidewalk sale in fashionably quaint downtown Bedford. All the shop owners had brought their wares out to the sidewalks on what looked like a sunny autumn day. Crowds of shoppers strolled by, eating ice cream cones and stopping to look at paintings, handmade pottery, and furniture, and Nancy noticed with a sense of dread, jewelry. Nancy knew it was coming the minute she saw the jewelry display. Sure enough, the camera panned the crowd and focused on Connie Watson, a large shopping bag in her hand. Nancy's heart sank as she watched what happened next. Connie picked up a bracelet, the one Nancy had seen her wearing, and admired it for a minute. Then she seemed to ask the shop owner the price and reluctantly put it back on the display table. "Now just watch," Nancy told her friends. "She's about to make the biggest mistake of her life." Hovering at the edge of the jewelry table, Connie waited until the owner was busy with about 6 customers at once. Then a close-up courtesy of Jake the cameraman showed her hook a finger under the bracelet and slide it into her conveniently waiting shopping bag. The camera pulled back then, and Connie melted into the crowds that filled the sidewalk. But Jake wasn't through with Connie. His next shot caught her going up the front steps of the high school, the early morning sun glinting on her new gold bracelet. "So far we've seen someone covering up an injury and someone shoplifting," George said. "I wonder what's next." "I'm not sure I want to know," Bess shuddered. "This whole thing gives me creeps." "Oh no." Nancy pointed to the television screen and shook her head in amazement. "It's Hal Morgan. I should have guessed." The next installment of Jake's horror show followed Hal, nervous nail chewer and future Harvard scholar, straight to the door of the office of the Bedford High principal. Like Walt Hogan, Hal probably thought he was alone because he glanced furtively around before entering the office. The camera didn't follow him inside. It held steady on the closed door. 5 seconds passed and then the door opened. Out came Hal, who stood still, obviously trying to work something out in his mind. "You can almost hear the wheels turning in his head," George remarked. "He's empty-handed. I wonder what he's after." "Answers," Nancy said. Bess looked confused. "Huh?" "Just keep watching," Nancy told her. "You'll see what I mean." Having worked out the problem, Hal walked quickly to another door. Without bothering to look behind him, he opened it and went inside. The camera stayed on the sign on the door, which read, "Counselor's Offices." When Hal came out this time, he wasn't empty-handed. He didn't look worried or confused anymore either. The camera gave Nancy and her 2 friends a brief glimpse of Hal's triumphant smile, but it lingered longest on what he held in his hands, answer books for the Scholastic Aptitude Test. "How could Jake tape that without Hal seeing him?" George asked. "He really knew his video stuff," Nancy said. "He probably set that one up by remote control. That would explain why the offices had been broken into earlier. He must have been rigging up the camera." She thought a minute. "I wouldn't even be surprised if he gave Hal the idea for stealing those answers just so he could tape the whole thing. After all, Jake did work in the principal's office." Wavering black bars and dancing snowflakes had appeared on the screen, and Nancy turned off the VCR and the television. "I'm glad that's over," she commented. "So am I." Bess stood up and stretched. "I don't know why, but movies always make me hungry. Even this one. Let's go see what's in the refrigerator." In the refrigerator, they found leftover takeout Chinese food. Sitting at the round oak kitchen table, the 3 friends discussed Jake's tape between bites of lo mein and shrimp fried rice. "Obviously, Connie didn't buy that bracelet," Nancy said. "She stole it. And after Hal lost so much ground trying to become class president, he knew the only way he'd get into Harvard was to cheat on the SAT so that he could get unusually high scores." Bess poured herself some more diet soda. "And poor Hunk, it must be awful to feel that desperate." "Why do you think Jake did it?" George asked. "Money?" "Maybe." Nancy crushed thoughtfully on some ice cubes. "But I think it was more of a power trip. He would find someone's weak spot and dig in. Jake liked knowing everyone's secrets. That's probably how he found out about me in time to tape us at the mall that day. He must have had his ear to Mr. Parton's door, and Mr. Parton talked to my father. He knew my secret, too. He liked being the king of the mountain." "Yeah, well, someone finally pushed him off," Bess said, "and no wonder. He must have had things on half the kids in school." "But he only has 3 people on tape," George pointed out. "Nancy, do you really think one of them killed him?" Nancy shrugged her shoulders in frustration. Later, after George and Bess had left, she took a long hot shower trying to come up with an answer to George's question. Walt Hogan was strong enough to give Jake that final push, she thought, especially if he'd been angry, and Hal wasn't exactly a lightweight. If he'd been desperate enough, he might have just decided to challenge Jake. She couldn't rule out Connie either. Sweet, gossipy Connie Watson was as strong a candidate for murderer as the other 2 guys. Anyone could have pushed him. Nancy turned around and let the warm, misty spray roll off her back. Jake Webb wasn't just a thief and a vandal, she thought. He was the Bedford High blackmailer. Getting power from kids who'd made mistakes must have given him a kick, a sick, sadistic kick. But someone had finally kicked him back. The question was who? Was it really one of the kids on the tape, Walt or Connie or Hal? Could one of those 3 Bedford High students have been so determined to get out from under Jake's thumb that he or she murdered him just to keep a secret safe? All right. We are officially halfway done with Secrets Can Kill. Thank you guys so much for listening and watching, whether live or later on. We'll be back again soon to finish that book up, probably sometime this week in the morning, maybe even tomorrow morning. I'll see how early I feel like getting up. I'm going to take a quick break, about 10 minutes, and set up my next stream, which will be a game. So feel free to come back if you'd like to hang out while I play some Cat President on Steam, also stream. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the week. Take care of yourselves very much. Much love from me to you, and I'll see you all later.